Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Finding the Source. I'm with my cohort host. Oh my God, Ashley Lusky. Ashley, your name's not even up here, is it?
No, I know we should have adjusted it to keep Ashley.
And our guest tonight is Michael Birkner, who is, look at this, he is working to the very last second. That's right. Very impressive, Michael. Michael, this is our first show for the season, and Ashley had promised me, I think, or yes, she did, that she was going to come up with a great opening for us. She is very talented. You play the piano, and at home you have a nice little keyboard, and I was hoping that you'd come up with a theme song for us, but I suggested this, and Michael, I think that you would have actually enjoyed it. I said to Ashley, we should start the show with Jersey Girl. Michael Birkner he's from Jersey, and I have to believe, Birkner, you are a huge Springsteen fan. Is that true?
No, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons was my group. That's what I grew up listening to. Springsteen came after I became an academic guy, and I wasn't paying attention anymore.
So you're going to also tell us that Bon Jovi is not on your radar either.
All right. You got to go back to the 60s, man.
All right. Well, Michael, I think that there's always time to learn new music, and especially from your home state. So you know what? We're going to make you a little playlist, some Bon Jovi.
All right.
Right? There's all kinds of some great. So we'll get that to you soon.
That's good.
So, Michael, we're so pleased that you're here to join us. For those in the audience, Michael Birkner is a professor at Gettysburg College. He did his undergraduate at Gettysburg College and graduated 1970. Is that correct?
72.
72. And then from there, he went on to the University of Virginia, where he received his PhD. And then he did a number of things. Worked at the University of Kentucky. He on the Henry Clay papers, I believe.
Nope.
Oh,
Carol Reardon worked on the Henry Clay papers.
But you were there teaching.
I taught at the University of Kentucky. Yeah.
And you bounced around from some other places. You went up to Dartmouth for a little bit, and you were also at Millersville before you landed back at Gettysburg College. And of course, Michael, as you'll discover here later in our conversation, among the many things he teaches, he has a course that is the required class for all history majors, historical methods. And that course is considered the boot camp for our undergrads. And Michael has taught it for a very long time. There are lots of war stories that have come out of that class, and they are all good war stories, Michael. In fact, my wife and maybe some of my colleagues at CWI think that I should probably go back. My editing skills are lacking. My footnotes are incredibly irregular, and it probably would suit me. But I think I need to get into Professor Birkner's class.
Absolutely.
Maybe he'll let me in.
You're always welcome, Pete. You're always welcome.
Thank you so much. Well, tonight we are going to talk about an article that you published on Dwight Eisenhower and the Legacy of the Civil War. I unfortunately do not have the book, but I want to tell the audience that it is part of a collection of essays entitled The Long Civil War, New Explorations of America's Enduring Conflict, edited by John David Smith and Raymond, is it Arsenal?
Yes, Arsenal. Right.
And again, published by the University of Kentucky Press. It has a number of fine scholars looking at a wide range of topics. I saw one by Diane Somerville. They look at about suicide, which looked, I think, particularly interesting. There's also one on Emory Thomas. And there's one on U.B. Phillips, the Southern historian that John David Smith did. The point being is there is a real diverse lineup here, all kinds of, I think, important and interesting articles. And Professor Birkner's article is one of them about Dwight D. Eisenhower. So I'd like to get us started here. Michael, what we do is we just sort of go back and forth and very informal. Those at home, they are, of course, free to write the question. And encourage them. Please do. Please do. And maybe you have some of the veterans from methods class.
That's right.
A little revenge.
That's right. Some of the students are watching tonight. I know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'd like Michael to get started with a quote that you included in your piece, a quote from Robert Penn Warren, which I'm going to read to everyone right now. This is from Robert Penn Warren from his book, The Legacy of the Civil War, published in 1961. And the quote is, Americans are happy in their forgetfulness. Americans are happy in their forgetfulness. And so I was curious, Michael, why did you go with that quote?
Well, I think for two reasons. Number one, Robert Penn Warren's one of my favorite writers. I just admire his work so much. But obviously, I admire a lot of writers, and I picked that quote rather than that of another writer I admire. I think it reflected a point that is implicit in the article and that I think is true about Americans and history so much, and that is that we don't really learn from history. And a good example of this that came to my mind, that's not Civil War related, but that fits Warren's commentary, is in the commentaries that we got on 9/11 and from so many different media about how Americans lost their innocence because of the terrible bombings, that happened, the planes flying into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and of course the tragedy in Shanksville, which saved another of our Capitol buildings. What innocence did we have? Why did we have innocence? It had a lot to do with the fact that we're forgetful about our own past. If you look at American history, we're always losing our innocence, and yet we're always back to being innocent again. And I quipped in my class, in my first year seminar yesterday about this. I said, it's like, I perhaps am pushing this a bit, but it's about a prostitute, claiming virginity. It's just,
yeah. But Michael, don't you think that's in part the media that uses that? It's the right word here. It's a discourse. It's a discourse that is compelling and gets people to look and to read. And it's unfortunate because, as you point out, it is a complete denial of American history. We've never been innocent people. There's never been a people anywhere, at least to my reckoning, who've ever been innocent.
And Pete, let me go one step further. And you actually are more expert on this than I am, but I'm going to put it out there, and we could, and Ashley might want to have something to say about it as well. But when you think about American history, take Civil War and Reconstruction in particular, and think about what a great writer like W.B. Du Bois was trying to tell us about Reconstruction. That was our history, but Americans weren't really interested in that history. They were embracing a very different triumphalist kind of history in which African Americans' suffering and indignities were simply not part of the storyline. And that's one of the reasons why my article was fun to write, because I admire Dwight Eisenhower very much. As a scholar, as a detached scholar, I admire so much of what he stood for and did in his life. But at the same time, I think the article was trying to show that even as he tried to navigate a very tight line in terms of how he dealt with the past, he didn't do it very well.
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of stood out about that particular quote to me was Eisenhower was someone who was happy in his lack of forgetfulness on the one hand, because he was such a reader and he was so into history. And I hope maybe we next can talk a little bit about that, the different influences, historical influences and literary influences that helped to shape the way he thought about his role as a leader, a military leader and a politician. But he was also happy in forgetting key parts of that past as well. And of course, that has to do with the racial components of Reconstruction and what he's supposed to be facing, or a lot of people think he's supposed to be facing as president, and then in the years afterward.
I would just quickly add that it is a reminder. I'm going to be a little easy on Ike here. I would say not so much that he forgot what was available to him.
Right.
And in terms of how Reconstruction was depicted, it was that this was a great tragedy, and that great tragedy was not, of course, for Black folks, but for white folks. So I think it's maybe, I would say, asking a little bit too much of Ike. That he could have read beyond that.
That is very true. And one of the central things that I was, planning to have a conversation with you about this evening was the degree to which your socialization and the people that you are associated with as an adult have a lot to do with determining your perspectives, not just on current events, but on the history that shapes your views of current events. And so I think both of your comments are totally pertinent, and I have no quarrel with what either of you had to say.
Before we get back to Ike, I'll just put it out there. I think that we're going to see in this historical moment in which we live that the attention that is devoted to the African American experience, one that all of us believe is absolutely important and essential, something that's not new under the sun, though. I think we need to note that. I think we also will see 20 to 30 years from now that emphasis, to some degree, did not fully take in all the complexities that we have, maybe to some, yes, I will say it, that we've maybe over-racialized some things. I suspect that's what we'll see. So we should not pretend, as some do, that we are somehow liberated from our contemporary issues. I suspect we'll look back and see very good history done, important history done. We all believe those stories need to be told, but let's not kid ourselves that we could, in the rush to do this, lose something very valuable.
Oh, I certainly do agree with that, Pete. And that's a conversation you could have with almost any historian on your show, because it's something that concerns us all.
So important, yeah. Yeah. I think what Ashley was saying is, could you just bring it for our audience, tell us a little bit about Ike, his youth and what he was reading. And I found that part of your article to be absolutely fascinating.
Well, Dwight Eisenhower is kind of our Horatio Alger image of America. He comes from the heartland of America. He lives from the horse and buggy age into the jet age. He almost lived to see men walk on the moon. He died in March of '69. Men walked on the moon, a few months later. He lived through world wars. He lived through technological change that was almost unimaginable when he was a boy. And he seems to have adapted to just about everything in a very effective way. Look, he grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak, in Abilene, Kansas, with a very large family of boys, a father who was not successful, had attended some college, which was unusual in those days, but nonetheless worked as a mechanic in a creamery because he failed in any business that he had tried. The family basically was very disciplined, very religious. Each of the boys was expected to do their share of the housework and the gardening, and to make their own money for the fun that they wanted. And it was a very close-knit family, and a very ambitious one. The parents expected the kids to reach as high as they could based on their talent, and most of the sons got higher education and were very successful in their respective fields. What's interesting here is that Ike's mom was a pacifist, as was his father. His mom was a much greater influence on him than his father. But Ike, of course, enters the military. And there's a little story that it's not in my article, but I've read this, where you ask the question, did she protest Ike going to West Point? And the answer is she didn't. But the only time Ike saw her cry in the first 20 years of his life was when he boarded the train in Abilene for West Point. But she never said a word in negative about his going there, because she knew this was his liberation to get the education he wanted and to move up in the world.
And in terms of the kinds of education that he gave himself as well, in terms of being such an avid reader, can you tell us a little bit more about kind of the wide appetite for reading that he enjoyed, and why he was drawn to certain historical figures, especially in his youth?
Yeah, absolutely, Ashley. And let me say quickly, as a broad generalization, that the two kinds of books that he was just preternaturally most interested in were history books and Westerns. There's the former associate director of the Eisenhower Library, with whom I'm friendly, has published an article about Eisenhower and his gargantuan appetite for reading Westerns, even during the middle of the Second World War, when he's commanding, Allied forces fighting Hitler. But as a young man, as a kid, as a teenager, he was fascinated by notable historical figures. He liked underdogs. He liked, for example, Hannibal was one of his, the Carthaginian general was one of his heroes. He read as much as he could. His parents had a pretty well-stocked closet of books, and he invaded that closet whenever he could. In fact, his mother suggested he was a bit too much of a bookworm and needed to get out of the house a little bit more. It's also worth noting that when he graduated from Abilene High School, the yearbook editor wrote a little riff about every student who was graduating and looking ahead 25 years, and the prediction was that Ike would become a professor of history at Yale. So that tells you something about his reputation even among his peers. Now, that said, don't get the wrong impression. He was not a junior Michael Birkner, who was a nerdy bookworm. He was rough and tumble. He did everything that a a physically healthy kid would be doing in Kansas at the turn of the 20th century. He fished, he hunted, he played poker, he wrestled, he fought, he was in fights all the time in the schoolyard. He was a very, standard kid. But the thing about Ike that stood out was that he wasn't the kind of person who ever held grudges against anybody. People liked him. And he had that natural magnetism that he carried through the rest of his career that you can see even as a teenager in Kansas.
Yeah. I think we have a quick question here that would be, does it seem relevant? I'm looking at quite a distance from the screen. But...
Yeah, someone just wrote in, wasn't Ike's mother Mennonite? Was the rest of the family Mennonite?
And it's from our good friend Patty Lawson.
Well, believe it or not, his mother and father were Jehovah's Witnesses. They came from Pennsylvania, from a tradition of what was called the River Brethren, which was a branch of Calvinism. But when they were in Kansas, they were full-blown Jehovah's Witnesses, met with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And this is a part of Ike's life that he didn't exactly disown, but he never spoke about it. My friend Jack Hall, a retired professor at Kansas State University, has just written and will soon publish a book on Eisenhower and the Eisenhower family's religious beliefs. And it's really, I read it and did a blurb for the book. And it is just an outstanding piece of work, which will give us an entirely, I think, distinctive perspective on Eisenhower and religious faith.
Michael, let's go back to Eisenhower's reading habits. And one of the books that stands out in your essay that Eisenhower was very fond of was Lee's Lieutenants and R.E. Lee, written by historian Douglas Southall Freeman. So for our audience, would you mind just give us a little bit, who was Freeman and his place in the field, and then why was his work so compelling to Ike?
Yeah, that's a fine question. Let me also note that the book, he didn't read these books as a young man. He probably read other things about the Civil War and Lee as a very young man. The Lee books didn't come out until the 1930s. But Ike, by every indication, read them avidly. Douglas Southall Freeman was a journalist in Richmond, in the leading Richmond paper, and he was, at the time of his serving as a journalist, also a biographer of both Lee and George Washington. And by the way, if you read the books, Lee and Washington seem awfully similar in the way that he characterizes them. It's like reading David McCullough's Harry Truman. Harry Truman sounds an awful lot like John Adams, and John Adams sounds an awful lot like Harry Truman, right? But the books were bestsellers. Obviously, they were in the homes of virtually every middle-class family in the South, much as Carl Sandburg's biography of Lincoln in 6 volumes was in the home of most every middle-class family in the North. In both cases, they were in people's libraries. Eisenhower was interested in military history, of course, from the get-go, so he naturally gravitated to these books. And let's face it, the Freeman books are almost hagiographical in their interpretation of Lee. He really could do no wrong. And Eisenhower absorbed this, and Lee comes through as a very noble character as well as a great military leader. And so Eisenhower imbibes that view of Lee and I think maintains it. And it is worth noting, Ashley and Pete, that Douglas Southall Freeman, as an editor and as a Democrat, because everybody was a Democrat practically in Virginia at that time, was very early on devoted to the idea of Dwight Eisenhower being the next George Washington and becoming president of the United States. So by 1946, he's already writing letters to Eisenhower, urging him to think about becoming a candidate in 48. And then when Eisenhower does not pursue that lane, he goes back at it in 1950 and 51 and supports him avidly in 52.
That's awesome. I didn't know that at all. Yeah. Have you ever read any of Freeman's editorials and as they relate to Eisenhower?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
And it's basically that this man is going to be the leader we need, who's above party,
right,
who has done great deeds in the past and will lead us forward as a unified nation in the future. That's basically the message in his editorials, because he would send copies of what he wrote to Eisenhower.
Well, it's just a quick note that Freeman's work really stood the test of time until maybe 15 years ago. I mean, that was what everyone read. It's what I read. It wasn't until, I think, Elizabeth Pryor's book, Reading the Man, which was a Lincoln Prize winner. That's how good the book was, that a book on R.E. Lee got the Lincoln Prize. But for those of you who want to read what I think is a compelling, fair, sensitive treatment of Lee, and takes Lee on his terms, Elizabeth Pryor, Reading the Man, you absolutely can't go wrong. And she was a beautiful writer. She tragically died. She was killed in a car accident in Richmond.
Right.
She was just a hell of a historian.
And the work ever since has been further and further sort of pulling Lee off of the pedestal that he's been on, until quite literally his statue went off the pedestal.
Just last week. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, quite famously, at least to a lot of people who have any familiarity with Eisenhower, he had these 4 portraits in the Oval Office, and one of them was Lee, and then he had Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin in there. And of course, Lee kind of stands out amongst the rest of those for obvious reasons. And the crux of your article that Pete and I were talking about before we signed on is really, how did Eisenhower's historical thinking and historical mindedness ultimately then shape the kind of policy decisions he made, the kind of military leader he chose to be, and the kind of president he chose to be, and how he chose to deal with controversial issues later on. Of course, that's a big question that we can unpack kind of in stages. But maybe to get started there, with Lee and what he saw as being a common trait that Lee shared with these other 3 greats who were decorating his Oval Office walls, and kind of how he tried to incorporate that early on into policy decisions.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Lee's integrity and his bearing were things that attracted Eisenhower to him. I would be reluctant to make any kind of a direct connection between Lee's generalship and Eisenhower's notion of command. I think that if we're going to understand Eisenhower as a military leader, you really go to Fox Connor, who I briefly discussed, and who's become, a mainstay in any of the major historical works about Eisenhower. Connor was a World War II officer who was put in command of the American mission in Panama after World War I. Eisenhower wound up coming down there by being chosen by Connor, who had a sense that he had potential. And Connor's relationship with Eisenhower was probably the crucial mentorship of Eisenhower's career, because Connor had Eisenhower reading in a different way. It's the difference between reading as a boy Hannibal and his efforts to fight against Rome and unavailing, and being kind of thrilled by what he did with elephants, and being sad that he was defeated and that Carthage was destroyed. There's a difference between that and Connor saying to Eisenhower, "You have to read Clausewitz, and we're going to go discuss it the next time we're on horseback." He didn't read Clausewitz once under Connor. He read it 3 times. And he also, when he read the histories of the Civil War with Connor, and he did, they discussed a lot of what are the errors, what are the strengths of these generals, what did they get, what did they miss. In that sense, I don't think Lee is particularly going to stand out in terms of strategy and tactics. I think it's more Lee, the personality, that stands out for Eisenhower. So Eisenhower does that. He also, remember, is mentored in part by Douglas MacArthur, who was a brilliant military mind, but also an utter prima donna, and someone who Eisenhower took as an anti-model of how you lead men. And Eisenhower was the opposite, really the antithesis of MacArthur, because Eisenhower was a soldier's general in a way that MacArthur never was. And it's personality, I think, that makes Eisenhower so successful in the Second World War, because he's got a very tough situation with a lot of hotheads and people who are very full of themselves to deal with, both on the American and on the British side. And he's got to somehow not knock heads, but work them to feel like they're making decisions that are in sync with his thinking. And he does that very brilliantly.
Michael, you're correct. It's very hard to make these direct connections between his reading, particularly of Freeman, and his command decisions. But some of the things that you just said, I think you're spot on, that Eisenhower saw in Lee a model of a general and of a man that he thought he should emulate. And the other point you just made, the challenges that Eisenhower faced when confronting all these very difficult personalities and a lot of prima donnas. In Lee's Lieutenants, one of the strengths of that book is how Freeman shows Lee as a very crafty, very strategic way in dealing with subordinates, and ways that he never humiliated them, in ways in which he moved individuals who were not doing their job as he saw it, and he was able to shuffle them around so that they would be less of a threat to his own army. So time and time again, the politics of command, Lee truly excelled at that. We like to think of Lee almost exclusively on the battlefield, but in fact, it's what he did behind the scenes is what, I think Eisenhower and most professional military men would probably, and women would say, that's what gets an army to victory. It's what happens before you actually get into that combat situation. It's logistics, it's the management of personnel, it's the understanding of politics, it's all of those things. And Freeman, I think he did a nice job with Lee in that regard, although you are correct.
Well, I very much appreciate that comment, because what you just said is very connected to the way Eisenhower led. Eisenhower did not lead by demand or by pounding tables. He led by modeling himself to his men. And just as you said with Lee, Eisenhower had an empathy for his men that they appreciated. I'll give you an example. Whether it was in the military or whether it was as president, if you messed up, and in military parlance, that might be said in a different way. If you messed up and you thought that was the end of your career, and I could actually give you a good example in the White House of this, of a former Air Force general who messed up badly when he was in the FAA administration. Eisenhower would always say to the person, I give everybody one blunder a year. You made yours, now go back and do your job, and you have my full support. And that's the kind of thing that a good leader can do, because you know what? They'd walk over hot coals for someone who told them that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he wasn't a hanging judge. Now, let's say, it's also worth noting that he took his cues from George Marshall during the Second World War. When he had generals under him who were not performing, he got rid of them. Yeah. He usually did it in a nice way, meaning that he didn't single them out and embarrass them in front of others, but he got them the heck out of their commands and sent them back to a training mission in New Mexico during the Second World War. A good example of that would be Lloyd Friedenhall, who really was not up to the task of commanding American troops at Kasserine Pass in the early going of Second World War. And so he had the ability to sack people if, in fact, they weren't doing the job. But he was not a kind of person who would humiliate anybody.
One mistake a year, that's what you get. Ashley, I think that's what we're going to do at CWI from this point forward. Yeah, with my staff.
I'll tell you a local story that is just so Eisenhower. So this is in David Eisenhower's book, Going Home to Glory, which is a lovely book about Eisenhower's years in retirement in Gettysburg. So I just told you this story, and I could give you the specific examples from his military and political career. But David Eisenhower, when he was about 12 years old, was told by his grandfather that he'd pay him 25 cents an hour if he would paint over a white picket fence right outside the Eisenhower farm home. And David was looking for the money. And in those days, 1960, that would have been, $1 to do a few hours of work wasn't a bad deal. So anyway, he's starting to paint the fence, and one of his buddies comes over and says, "Hey, David, let's go do something." Whatever it was. And so David drops the paint can where it is, goes and does the thing. And his grandfather comes home from playing golf or working at the college, and he sees this, and he's not a happy camper. And David tells the story so beautifully. Basically what Ike says to him, just as David thinks he's going to drop the hammer on him, that he's never going to be able to do anything again, Ike says, "I give everybody one mistake a year." And he pats him on the head and lets him go.
That's great.
So he carried it over.
That's great. Well, that moderation that Eisenhower is so well known for and so celebrated for, that also translates into the way that he leads as a president as well. And so, kind of crossing over into that realm, a lot of people, of course, celebrate, hold him up for his federal response to integration in the 1950s at Little Rock, sending in the 101st Airborne, as you note in your article, to help assure that integration is going to happen at this very difficult time. But you also show how he's not totally some radical on board with, pushing civil rights to their absolute extreme at that particular point in time, that he knew that there were certain limits, and he had certain limits that he wanted to stay away from. He had that middle way of dealing in political situations. So can you kind of talk about how, in a broader sense, that more moderate approach to how he led in many military situations did kind of inform, and again, thinking back historically, how he moved forward as a president and in politics?
Sure. That's a lot of different things we could unpack here, and I'm going to focus on a couple of the aspects of your question. First off, I would say that when we talk about Eisenhower's moderation, we are talking about the presidency. There was nothing moderate about his fighting Hitler. He despised Hitler, he despised the Germans, and his philosophy of military command was overwhelming power, overwhelming force, crush the enemy. It wasn't anything less than that. And so moderation is really not relevant to that particular approach to his leadership. He ran for president, however, on what scholars would call the middle way, because he did not like what he saw happening under the New Deal and the Fair Deal, which what he thought was creeping socialism in the country, and a kind of this, what would you call it, a lowering of Americans' initiative as entrepreneurial people and independent-minded people, and people with responsibility for themselves. He worried that the federal authority was essentially pushing too far, too fast, and he didn't want to roll back the New Deal and the Fair Deal. He knew that most of these programs, like Social Security, unemployment compensation, housing programs, education programs, were popular. What he wanted to do was to give the country a little breathing space to absorb these programs and to find a way fiscally responsibly to push forward. And one of the things about Eisenhower is that you can't use one generalization to describe his domestic policy. He was conservative here, he was liberal there, he was moderate here, he was a quasi this and he was a quasi that. He's very hard to pin down, but on specific issues, you can see that he is a very responsible leader.
Michael, can I jump in just real quickly here? As a nice summation of Eisenhower's sort of disposition toward politics. And I think the very first paragraph in your article, you mentioned the 1964 election and the Republicans, they get hit pretty hard. Goldwater gets defeated easily. But Eisenhower steps up and he says, look, everyone, we are the party of Lincoln. So could you, again, help us to do two things here? What did he mean by that, Eisenhower? And the second thing is that an accurate, really historical connection? Was the Republican Party at that time really the party of Lincoln?
Well, I think it was in a way that it is not today. I think one way of making this point, Ashley and Pete, would be to note that if you're looking at the civil rights measures that either were put forward and died or that were put forward and passed in the 1950s and the 1960s, guess where a higher percentage of pro-civil rights legislation came from? It came from Republican votes, because the Solid South was solidly segregationist, and the Solid South was all Democratic. Now, you had Hubert Humphrey and you had other liberals in the North who were pressing hard. Jacob Javits from New York, Clifford Case from New Jersey, I could name others who were totally in the camp of civil rights. Actually, Case was a Republican and Javits was a Republican, now that I think about it. But you had liberal Democrats for sure, but the party was schizoid. Whereas the Republican Party had ultra-conservatives from the Midwest who would vote no on anything where the federal government is to get involved. But many Republicans were pro-civil rights and admired Lincoln tremendously, as Eisenhower did. I should add that civil rights was not particularly on Eisenhower's agenda. If you had to draw a list of 10 priorities that Eisenhower had in taking office in 1953, civil rights would not have made the top 10. But he appointed key figures in his administration. Two in particular I'll mention: Herbert Brownell as Attorney General and Sherman Adams, who was his chief assistant in the White House. Both Northerners who were very pro-civil rights. It was Brownell who pushed Eisenhower to move forward on integrating the military different districts, the Washington, D.C. school systems and public facilities in particular, and Brownell who pushes forward pro-civil rights jurists for the appellate courts, the district courts, and of course the Supreme Court of the United States. That is big. And Eisenhower was not deeply engaged in these matters until he had these conversations with Brownell and supported by Sherman Adams and a couple of others in his administration. And because Eisenhower did believe in equality under the law, it was not a hard sell for him to support the issues that Brownell was in fact advocating. Of course, it caused all kinds of troubles for him in the South.
Right. So to kind of pause on that, civil rights wasn't at the top of his list. And there are numerous reasons for that. There are personal reasons, there are pragmatic reasons, and political reasons. Can you kind of walk us through some of the many different reasons why he doesn't place civil rights at the top of his list?
Well, for one issue, I can look at this from the perspective that he's got bigger game, in ending the Korean War, dealing with the Soviet Union, and that is in uncertainties with Stalin's death, and overall managing an economy which he felt had gotten completely out of whack under Harry Truman with this enormous spending through NSC 68, which some of you know about, and Eisenhower had to do something at the macro level that was much more directly important to him, to making sure the country was safe and sound, right? The second reason, I think, has to do with the fact that preternaturally, he was not interested in civil rights. He had been in the military, which was heavily dominated by Southerners. As late as 1946, when he testified before Congress about integrating the armed forces, he said, "Don't do it." And I think he later came to regret that testimony, but that represented where he was at that time. I think he grew a good deal, thanks in part to Brownell and others putting this on the table for him. And also, I think he just came to realize that America was not where it needed to be in terms of just basic legal equality for African Americans. For Eisenhower, voting was the key. He was much more interested in voting than he was in anything else.
Michael, just one last thing about Eisenhower and the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. It struck me that in a sense that Eisenhower was trying to resurrect the idea of free labor ideology. And for those at home, what I simply mean by that is the belief that any man or woman, through hard work, frugality, good moral, clean living, that one could move up the social ladder. And it seems to me that he was fearful that, in fact, and maybe the country was going to lose touch with that, but was quite certain that the Republican Party that he was a part of could be the champion of that, just as Lincoln and the Republican Party was in 1860. So I don't know if that's maybe a little bit of a stretch as we try.
No, it isn't. It's not a stretch at all. It's not a stretch at all. I think that's very part and parcel of his thinking about Lincoln. And let me put the other side of that coin. And you and Ashley know this quote better than I know it. And that has to do with, he would frequently quote a statement that Lincoln had made about what the role of the federal government was, and that is to let people do what they can do at their level. When they can't get it done, it moves up the ladder to the next level, and if the next level can't do it, then the federal government will take on the responsibility. You know the quote I'm talking about. And that was one of the ways in which he connected with Lincoln, because even in the 1950s, almost a century later, he's still quoting Lincoln.
And another term that you use in your article too, that you emphasize, is the kind of belief in the folkways idea of converting people to get on board with civil rights and inequality, whether it's legal or social, a more informal level. What does that mean? His belief in the folkways system rather than alternative methods of bringing about change.
Yeah, and this is where I think Eisenhower is at his weakest, because I give him credit for the actual measures that he took and the policies that he had on civil rights issues. He did the right thing in Washington, D.C. He did the right thing with the military. Everybody gives Harry Truman credit for integrating the military. Harry Truman spoke it, but he didn't do it. Eisenhower integrated the military. And of course, Ashley, a few minutes ago, you referred to what Eisenhower did at Little Rock, which was very forceful, caused him a lot of unpleasantness with Southerners, but he did the right thing at the right time. And he gets credits from historians for being decisive in that moment. But the thing about Eisenhower that I think is problematic, and I'm not speaking at the cathedral here, it's problematic for me as a person, as a historian, is that he has this notion that you really can't push too hard because you'll make people just get really angry, meaning the people who are in power, like white Southerners or white Northerners who are used to being top dogs against African Americans. And then you're going to have social chaos. So he says, in a folkways matter, he's saying, all right, we'll pass these laws, but we can't change hearts and minds immediately. That's going to take 10, 20, 50, 60, 80, 100 years. Well, the problem with that is that it leaves too much in place that is completely against the interests of a large segment of our population, which is African Americans. You're not going to move African Americans out of having the worst jobs at the worst pay if you're going to work on a folkways basis. You've got to go further. And that's something that Lyndon Johnson did understand and tried to act on in a way that Eisenhower wouldn't. Now, also keep in mind, the country wasn't ready for massive change. At least whites weren't ready for massive change in the 50s. But I think Eisenhower was not keen in terms of appreciating what African Americans were dealing with in that very time. I think he, as Thurgood Marshall would always say, slow means never.
Right.
Deliberate speed means never. And that Eisenhower never really quite grasped.
Well, and Michael, don't you think that the criticism of Eisenhower on this point, which you've made, and I think it's well-founded, but we should also maybe take a deep breath, because too often we went to see presidents and being able to exert influences far beyond their powers. And so, again, when we talk about America's forgetting the past, I think we also have a highly distorted understanding of what particularly someone in the Oval Office can do. And these kinds of movements, I mean, we saw this last summer with George Floyd. That things came together. It is spontaneous. This isn't just one person, one leader, or even a handful of leaders. These things just almost come out of nowhere. They feel like it, but when you look back, you can see the tentacles of all these things, right, that finally lead to this great implosion. So again, I get your criticisms of Eisenhower, and yet at the same time, it's hard for me to imagine how he could have possibly pushed hard without blowing up his party. And it's funny because we give Lincoln a lot of space there, right? He's got to hold that coalition together. He's got to get himself elected. He gets into the war. Don't push too hard on emancipation. You'll lose the Union war effort. We all give Lincoln some space. I think, empathy for almost all of our leaders would do us all some good.
I'm very sensitive to what your point is, and I think you make a very good point. Let me elaborate 1 second here, just so you understand my concern, and you don't have to really even agree with it. But I agree with your general premise, Pete. Think about something like the murder of Emmett Till in 1955, or the integration of Central High School in Little Rock in 57, where we give him credit for sending in, the 101st Airborne. Why couldn't Eisenhower have said something publicly? Yes. The way Kennedy did after Medgar Evers was shot and assassinated in 63. Why couldn't Eisenhower have sent a letter to the mother of Emmett Till and said, I feel your pain and this is unacceptable in our society? Why couldn't Eisenhower have shown those 9 young African Americans who put up with so much that year in Central High? Why could he have not shown a certain kind of empathy for them? It wasn't in his makeup to do it. And it would be perhaps unfair to ask him to do what he wasn't, comfortable doing. But for me, I think that a man who had so much empathy for so many people, he missed the boat on those occasions. And I think he was never a particularly avid rhetorician, the way that Kennedy, helped by Theodore Sorensen, was. But I think on that issue of the real ugliness of segregation and white supremacy, I think he could have done better, because he was such a popular leader and he had so much political capital.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a middle ground there where you're not expecting him to move the needle from one side to the other side completely, but maybe just to move a little bit more so down the line.
It's a great point about Emmett Till. That wouldn't have taken much.
And let me also say, on the other side of the question here, that Eisenhower is a practical politician, even though he won't admit to being so. He wants the South to move into the Republican Party. The Southerners liked Eisenhower. Half the South voted for him in presidential elections in 52 and 56. He even carried Louisiana in 1956 and Texas both years. If he's trying to win the South, the Republican Party, he's got to go very carefully and tread carefully on the issue of race, because Southerners, they know exactly what they will accept and what they won't accept from a president on these issues. The Republican Party was, in fact, in the North, a much more pro-integration, pro-civil rights party at that time. It changed after Barry Goldwater, right?
Absolutely.
That was the turning point. But Nixon and Eisenhower in the 50s were very pro-civil rights and gaining ground with African Americans at the same time that they're both looking for white votes from segregationists in the South. That's a very hard row to hoe, I think.
Absolutely. We're getting peppered with some questions here from our audience. We should give some. How about this one?
Howard Whitehead. That's someone who sounds familiar to me. My father. Yeah. Given Ike's views on civil rights, why did he view his appointment of Earl Warren as, quote, the biggest damn fool mistake of my life?
He did say it, but he wasn't referring to civil rights. Eisenhower, and we have this in Dave Nichols' book, A Matter of Justice, quite nicely laid out. Eisenhower never had a problem with Earl Warren on civil rights or in Brown versus Board. Eisenhower's problem with Earl Warren was with the criminal justice cases. He felt that the Warren court went way overboard against what he would consider a law and order approach to understanding the Constitution, and that it was essentially giving criminals more rights than they deserved. Eisenhower was very clear about that later in life in the articles he wrote for Reader's Digest. But, he did say the quote that your dad is referring to. It's just people tend to assume that it was an anti-civil rights position, and I would argue that it was not.
Yeah. We have another question. What basis of the rift between Eisenhower and Truman? Is that right? So I think this person's asking what happened with the relationship between Eisenhower and Truman. Did it sort of got a little frosty?
Oh, very frosty. Well, Eisenhower and Truman got along just fine in the 1940s when Truman was a senator and then vice president briefly and then president. You may know that in 1948, when Eisenhower was president of Columbia University, the Truman Secretary of Defense invited Eisenhower to come down to Washington once a week to be in the highest level of deliberation about how we were going to conduct the Cold War. And Truman knew it and encouraged this. Truman twice offered to step aside from the presidency if Eisenhower would run as a Democrat. Their relationship was quite cordial until Eisenhower decided to run for president. And guess what? Politics ain't beanbag. Eisenhower said some really tough things about Truman in 1952, and Truman had a thin skin, and he didn't like it, and he felt that Eisenhower had gone very far beyond normal politics in what he said, and he fired back just the same kind of hard stuff at Eisenhower that Eisenhower had fired at him, and the relationship just took a complete dive. The two men really did not speak for almost 10 years, and I'm sorry to say that Truman's only child, Margaret Truman Daniel, fed this because she despised Eisenhower. She was an old-fashioned liberal, and she fed her father's animus toward Ike. Even after her father died, she was continuing to attack Eisenhower in various articles and books. about her father and about other things. Where Eisenhower and Truman sort of made up was at Kennedy's funeral in 1963. They sat next to each other during the funeral, and they kind of buried the hatchet in November of 63. But it was politics. People don't like other people saying you're bad. And Eisenhower was saying that about Truman, and Truman fired that back at Eisenhower. And they didn't really ever patch it up for a decade.
Going to the Ron Hansen.
Yeah.
Another question is: did the momentum of McCarthy, Red Scare, the Red Scare and supporters factor in the addressing of race issues? So, how did the Red Scare and McCarthyism influence or shape, if at all, how Eisenhower thought and acted about race issues?
I don't think so. I think that the McCarthy thing, from Eisenhower's view, was a pathology in our political system that simply had to be extricated from or exterminated, whatever you want to say. And he worked behind the scenes for about 18 months to kneecap McCarthy. And ultimately, it was the Senate that had to do the job. The reason Eisenhower was not very open and forward in attacking McCarthy was he said this very directly to one of his aides. He said, the Senate is a club. He said, if I go out and attack McCarthy and say what a scoundrel he is, which he is, he said, McCarthy has 12 Republican senators who basically are in his amen corner, and they'll do whatever he wants to do. And he said, and I can't have a successful policy agenda without those 12 Republican votes. I don't give a damn about McCarthy personally, but we have a very tightly contested Senate. It was very evenly balanced from 53 to 56. And Eisenhower wasn't going to alienate people whose votes he needed for things like the St. Lawrence Seaway or national highways or building schools, things like that were part of his agenda. I think race really doesn't even make a major play on his consciousness until Brown v. Board and the massive resistance movement in the South, and Eisenhower trying to figure out what to do about that.
So to that question, we actually have a kind of a circling back question to the 1957 debacle at Central High. Do you think that Eisenhower was making a direct connection in his mind between some of the shortcomings of Reconstruction and the need to go in and assist with the military in this integration, or was it merely I need to do this to support the Constitution and enforce federal power?
Very much the latter, Ashley. Very much the latter. Eisenhower, when you get right down to it, bought into the same view of Reconstruction that someone like Claude Bowers had been putting forward in these best-selling books that he wrote, that George Fort Milton wrote a book called The Age of Hate. You guys know the historiography better than I do. Eisenhower was conversant with all of the literature that basically viewed people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner as bad guys. And let me say something about this, because I've spent a lot of my time getting to know the historian Alan Nevins through his papers, and a man I admire in many ways. But one of the things that absolutely stunned me was reading a transcript of a conversation that Alan Nevins had at a history roundtable, in which he was asked who he thought the greatest villains of the Civil War era were. And he says, Sumner and Stevens. And I'm like, what? Are you kidding me?
Seriously. Nevins said that.
And this is Alan Nevins, who was kind of a god of historians. Yeah. Now, Nevins, in his public writings, the books that he wrote, was obviously sympathetic to Lincoln, sympathetic to emancipation, sympathetic to some degree to the goals of Reconstruction. But to actually see the bad guys as being the people today we would call the good guys,
right.
You can understand why Eisenhower had a negative view of Reconstruction, because he had read the same stuff that was portraying the radical Republicans as the enemy.
And crossing that line, or I should say, challenging lost cause dogma, which Eisenhower did. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things you do with our students as it relates to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. But before we do that, this incident at Gettysburg with Montgomery, I think they're walking down from the tower on Culp's Hill. And so, Michael, why don't you tell the story and then the reaction to it, which is pretty amazing, I think.
Yeah, well, Bernard Montgomery, who was never someone Eisenhower, really loved, invited himself to Gettysburg in 1957 in May, and Eisenhower, of course, agreed to host him. And of course, the two generals went on the battlefield. And one of their trips, which was actually on a Sunday morning, was, as you said, to Culp's Hill. And as they're climbing down the ladder at Culp's Hill, Montgomery begins to bait Eisenhower about Lee's generalship. And, he says something kind of anodyne, like, I would have done it differently than Lee did it. And Eisenhower says, yeah, I'd have sacked him if he'd done what he did on day 3. And all these reporters are standing there, and they're like, whoa. And so, needless to say, the Associated Press and other news outlets quote Eisenhower, no doubt accurately, is what he said. And as I put it in the article, the cotton really hit the fan, right, in the South, because Southerners could not accept the idea that anybody could criticize Robert E. Lee, not even Dwight Eisenhower, who they may have voted for. That was a bridge too far. And as you're smiling because you know some of the quotes are in the article, which are pretty amusing.
There's one that's pretty salty, though. It was downright just nasty, and it made reference to the African American cemetery here in Gettysburg, and insinuated that basically Eisenhower got too close to that, spending too much time there, and had lost sight of who the true heroes were. So there was a little edge to some of those comments, but Eisenhower.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I guess the finale for this story is that Eisenhower had to make amends by pointing out that Lee was on the wall in the Oval Office, by saying how much he admired Lee. He was a great American, would never diminish Robert E. Lee, and basically hoping this thing would blow over, which it gradually did. But it was, to me, looking back at it as a historian, it's a reminder of just how pervasive the cult of Lee was, particularly in the South, and the lost cause, all the stuff that David Blight has written about and that you both have talked about in your classes and so forth. So it was not a happy moment for Ike.
Absolutely. So, Michael, you, over the years, escorted some of our students down to Kansas to Eisenhower's Presidential Library. And, what are some of the things that our students have done down there? I assume they'll probably take some more down there in the future. What kind of work have they been doing?
Well, they get their hands dirty. Pete, you take your students to the National Archives to get their hands dirty. It's really the same mission. And what happens, and I think this is something we would agree on, is that you get a college student who cares about a subject into documents that they then realize they're touching the stuff of history, and they get a chance to shape what it all adds up to. That's very motivating to them. And as a result, I can say that, several of my students over the years who went to Abilene with me have written extraordinarily good papers. One of them, by the way, is on our faculty now. That's Ian Isherwood. Ian wrote a paper for my Eisenhower seminar back around the year 1999 on Eisenhower and the Defense Reorganization Act of 1958. And he did a heck of a job on that. And of course, look at him now as a war studies professor at Gettysburg College. So, but a number of my former students, went on to become academics. And those who didn't still found that the business of writing a capstone paper and organizing raw materials that you might get at the Eisenhower Library was a real virtue.
Yeah. Michael, we'll conclude with this. Go back to your methods class, the legendary class. And again, for those who are not been history majors, are probably like, what the hell is a methods class? So, Michael, tell us, you get those students into that methods class. What are you trying to accomplish? What's the goal?
Well, just very briefly, I tell my students that the course is about building competence and confidence about doing history. And that means looking at the different discourses of history, facing up to the methodologies, particularly getting things right, like doing their footnotes right, looking at how historians can blunder and learning lessons from that. One of the things I learned a long time ago after reading a wonderful book by a University of Georgia professor named Peter Hoffer called Past Imperfect. One of the things I learned and took away from reading Hoffer's book, and I assign it regularly to my method students, is that it's much better to have the students read about the bad behavior of historians and to get all upset and angry about it than for me to just go blah, 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 don't do this, don't do that. It's like the old Gary Larson cartoon of the guy yelling at his dog Ginger, and he's going, Ginger, don't do this, don't do that. You've done it bad, Ginger. You're bad, Ginger. And then all Ginger's hearing is blah, 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 Ginger, Ginger, right? Well, I love that. But the students get into this when they see what Michael Belial did or what Ambrose did, right? Or Doris Kearns Goodwin did or what Joe Ellis did. All very, very strong historians in their way, but they misbehaved. So that's one of the things that I think is a learning lesson for them. Don't do what they did. And then there's, of course, just the reading of really interesting books that show different methodologies and that tell them a story. Let me close with this about the methods course, Pete, because I think you're running out of time. But there's a book that I've been assigning on and off for the last 2 or 3 years. I don't know if you and Ashley are familiar with it, but I really find it valuable. And it's a book by a historian or a retired historian from Williams College named Charles Dew. And it's called The Making of a Racist. And it's a description, I won't go on at length, but it's a description of his transformation from a socialized segregationist and white supremacist as a boy growing up in St. Petersburg, Florida, surrounded by a family of people who were white supremacists and relatives and the neighbors and everybody else in his milieu. And then going off to college and unlearning everything that he had essentially been normalized to believe in the first 18 years of his life in the South. And I remind students that they're not set in some kind of a stone about what they're going to be for the rest of their lives, that they need to use their college years to explore and to rethink and to test some of their own convictions, just to make sure that they're on the right track. Because guess what? Maybe what you thought when you were 16 is not as valid when you're 20. And I think that Charles Dew does that so beautifully in that very short and pithy book. I love talking about it with my students.
Well, Michael, Ashley and I can attest to the fact that during our time here, we have encountered so many of your students and so many of your students who've done just exactly what you've said. They have come into your course with certain preconceptions about the past, about how they should do history, and you've done them a great service because you challenge them and you push them to think outside of their comfort zone, and then you remind them, don't ever get in the comfort zone, ever, right? They should always be thinking about these assumptions that you work from and the methodologies you employ, and you work them, challenge them, and you do just that. You get them off to a fantastic start. In fact, we have a number of your former students in our chat box over here. Michael cannot see it, unfortunately. And so they're here as well, still soaking in your wisdom after all these years.
You're a little too generous, but very kind.
Well, we have one last takeaway, and we know what it is. Ashley and I are going to work on a nice playlist with you. It's going to be Jersey. It's going to be mostly Bruce, right? And Nebraska. I think Nebraska will work for me. You like Nebraska? Are you not a Springsteen fan? God, you know.
All right, I'll listen, Pete.
We'll be in touch about that. Well, we want to thank Michael for joining us this evening, and all the folks that have come in to listen and to offer their comments and questions. And our next Finding the Source is?
Yeah, it's going to be a while, actually. It's not until the end of October. I want to say it's October 27th or so. And that one's going to be with Sarah Hanley Cousins, who is a professor at University of Binghamton.
Yes.
And she's going to be talking about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and disability in the Civil War North. Yeah,
very a different look on Chamberlain. It's a fascinating paper. I read it. And then finally, if you can read this, Ashley's going to be very impressed. I've done a lot of marketing for this. I never get the dates right. Ready? October 8th, 9th, and 10th. Wow. How about that? Wow. There's improvement. We would love to see you all. Come to Gettysburg. It's going to focus on North Carolina during the war. Judkin Browning is going to open the event at the Majestic. And then Saturday and Sunday, we'll have tours, mostly walking in the field. Scott Hartwig will be joining us. Ashley's going to be doing her Iverson tour. On Sunday, we're going to be walking Pettigrew's Attack. And love to see you all. We missed you all, man. It's been, we're going pushing 2 years now. So 8th, 9th, and 10th, look it up on CWI, and hopefully we'll see you in a few weeks. Yeah. Ashley, good seeing you. Michael, again, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thank you all, and we'll see you in October.
Thanks so much.
Take care.